Buon giornata, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, today's ink, well, it's by DeAtramentis, and it's one of those inks that's named after a significant person in history. And this one, I don't know, I'd almost say that it's personal to me. This one is named after Dante Alighieri, the famous author. He had an even greater impact on his language, Italian, than Shakespeare did for English, and that is really saying something. He, of course, wrote in Tuscan, because in Italy, different regions had completely different languages, essentially, and his Tuscan and his writings essentially led to Tuscan becoming what we now understand as the Italian language. He was born in Florence in 1265, I believe. Yes? Yeah. And he died in Ravenna in 1321, in part because he got in trouble. His most significant work is, of course, the Divine Comedy, Dante's Inferno, but there's also Purgatorio and Paradiso. Just the Inferno is the most interesting one. However, he got in a lot of trouble with the church for trying to put to paper the realm of God, essentially, and especially not in Latin. He wrote in Italian, which at that time was a big deal. But yeah, famous author, influenced tons of people. I mean, he influenced everyone from Petrarch, Boccaccio, Shakespeare, Blake. However, I hate this color, which is somewhat disappointing. I don't hate it. It's just not my style. So it's pink. I don't like pink. I'm sorry. But yes, okay, ink. Moving on. All the tests were done in this Waterman Hemisphéré, which is actually a fine, but I'm going to try and bring this close so you can see. See how that nib is bent? See how it's hooked down like that? It's the only way it will write, because I brought this to college with me and stupidly lent it to someone. But now it essentially writes like an extra fine, but it's very smooth. But yeah, that's the only pen I used, because I wanted to show this ink at its best, and DeAtramentis has DeAtramentis syndrome, so... But yeah, as you can see, not a lot of water resistance. You can vaguely see where the initial drop was put, but it's all being pushed up. You get sort of this magenta almost right at the edges, which is somewhat fascinating. Now, the interesting thing is I don't have anything quite like this. Yeah, so here's Dante in the middle. And then DeAtramentis Scented Orchids, which is just a little more red. This has just like a touch more purple to it. And then Noodler's Kinishi Huang, which is just a little too bright. But actually, color is fairly similar, so. Alright, paper test. Top-down density Clairefontaine, 90 grams per square meter. I'm going to try and hold this still, but I am highly caffeinated. Yeah. It's one of his famous quotes, instead of the quick brown fox. Now, it did take 9 seconds to dry, but this is incredibly dense paper. You don't get a ton of shading, but you do get a tiny, tiny bit. It's not, you know, it's not tripping all over itself with shading, so. But yeah, there's no bleed, there's no feather, there's no spread. The flow was, I'd say, a 5.5 out of 6, or, sorry, 5.5 out of 10. You don't have to fight it out of the pen, it'll just go, and yet it's not flying out of the nib, which is quite nice. Now, as the chromatography kind of implied, not a lot of water resistance. That is mostly gone. Yeah, it dyed the page. But yeah. Next up is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter, where again, it took 9 seconds to dry, but this is still fairly dense paper and has a ceramic coating. Now, this is a very vibrant color. It's somewhere between like a scarlet and a magenta. It's just not my style, but still, different quote. It's very well behaved to the point where I kind of wish that I'd gone back and also put it in a broader wetter nib, but still, yeah, no bleed, no feather, no spread, no sheen, no echo. It's all good. Except for the water test. The water test, it's gone. Like, you can barely see the little bits where it was, and it dyed the page, but it is really, really gone. Next up is Tomoe River Paper, which, of course, draws out dry times, but it barely did. And it definitely brought out shading. You can see a bit of a halo effect through here. I didn't see any sheen, but I almost started to wonder if I did put this in a really broad, really wet nib, if you would get some sheen, but yeah. No bleed, no feather, no spread, as you would expect on Tomoe River. It doesn't like to do any of those things. Echo is, of course, always to taste, and this is quite fine, extra fine. The scrubby is fairly dense, but, yeah, it's all about personal preference. But yeah, this paper loves to let ink slide away when you add more water, and that is exactly what it did. You can barely see what was ever there, so, Now, next up is the world's worst 20-pound copier paper, and it sort of demonstrated itself as such. Now, despite this being a quite fine nib, there is some spread. It sort of goes into just being a fine. There is some feathering. We're going to try and bring this close so you can see. It's not obscene, but that's kind of what I would expect because there's not much ink going down because it is a very fine nib. It's not overly wet. 2 seconds to dry. Yeah, there is some very near bleed in essentially throughout, and that's a disaster, but yeah. So that's not encouraging for such a fine nib, but still, you lose all shading, and that absolutely feathered and exploded. However, I don't know, depending on how small you write, maybe you could recover that, or maybe just use something half a step up from the world's worst copier paper. Food for thought. Now, next up is Mead Notebook Paper, which is even thinner than the 20-pound copier paper. And I think you might be able to see we definitely get some feathering through here. You can see the grain of the paper with the feathers, which is somewhat depressing. Definitely no shading. 2 seconds to dry. Yeah. There's some very, very near bleed, which is not great for such a fine nib, but yeah. And this ink was fairly fresh. I'd say it was about 2 to 3 days old, so it had a bit of time to reach that troublesome maturing level, but no abundant DeAtramentis syndrome in this case. The water test is a mess. It absolutely feathered and exploded. I mean, I wrote that and I could barely tell you what it says. Now, lastly is Moleskine notebook paper, which I hate because it is very poorly behaved. Yeah, you do get a lot of woolliness, you get a lot of feathering. See that? And it's everywhere. But oddly, you do kind of almost get a little bit of shading, like 2%, but yeah, and it took 6 seconds to dry, which I don't understand because this is somewhat absorbent paper. Yeah, not great pen, paper, and ink combo. It almost comes through in a few spaces. You can kind of see where it wants to come through. The scrubby definitely left a haze of pink there. The water test absolutely exploded. Feathered. Again, I could barely tell you what that said, regrettably. But yeah, so there you go. There's DeAtramentis Dante Alighieri. Wonderful author. Very bold color. If you like this kind of color, I'd say give it a try. But as always, since it's a DeAtramentis ink, I say keep it fresh and go easy on the cheap papers. For your consideration from the Triple N Network, if you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching. Bye.